Today I'm going to explain why I mainly read white male theologians. Need I say more? Here we go. I've seen many blogs pop up lately that say top 5 minority theologians, top 5 female theologians that you need to read. I saw one blog that said even 5 books that aren't on white males' bookshelves or something like that. And I wanted to respond to this trend, which is essentially that I don't like it because most of the theologians I read are mainly white male theologians. And here I'm going to explain why. Number one. These are basically general responses to this trend of trying to create basically really is to fabricate an equal opportunity, or not an equal opportunity, rather an equal outcome of balance and representation, essentially buying into an intersectionality mindset and applying that to your normative bibliography for theological inquiry. So these are my responses to that. Okay, so number one, there is no such thing as a race-specific theology. Okay, there are 3 problems with the concept of a race-specific theology. Number one, the idea of a race-specific theology that doesn't make material claims about race suffers from categorical ambiguity. Okay, so there's no such thing as a white theology. There's no such thing as a black theology. You can have feminist and Marxist theologies. You can even have racist theologies that explicitly teach that certain races are inferior to others. So, for example, sort of infamously, you may have heard of him, you may have not. The Bellum era Civil War Southern Presbyterian theologian. Robert Louis Dabney, Southern Presbyterian theologian, he said in a speech before the Synod of Virginia, 1867, he said, quote, "An insuperable difference of race, made by God and not by man, and of character and social condition, makes it plainly impossible for a black man to teach and rule white Christians to edification," end quote. That is Robert Louis Dabney. That's racist theology. That's immoral racism, right? And the inability to distinguish between explicitly racist theological claims, which do exist, like Dabney's, and race-specific theology based on the race of a speaker, okay? Which that doesn't exist. That's not real. Okay, that distinction and the inability to make that distinction, okay, between explicitly racist or racially charged claims and so-called race-specific theology predicated on the basis of the skin color of the speaker, right? If you can't make that distinction, well, then you are going to be susceptible to a conceptual error. That is an error of semantic and categorical ambiguity that doesn't stand up under logical scrutiny, okay? A second problem with the notion of race-specific theology is that the idea of race-specific theology, such as white male theology, is itself racist, and the notion that when a white theologian talks about the Trinity, well, then that's white Trinitarianism, that it's both racist and conceptually absurd, okay? So the Nazis used this category as a means of attacking Einstein and his Einsteinian physics, and even as a means of critiquing Freudian analysis in the mid-20th century. They called these concepts, such as Einsteinian physics and Freudian psychoanalysis, they called them the Judiswissenschaft, the Jew science, right? And those who decry white male theology use the same philosophical category, and it is racist, which is to say that you predicate a racial quality to a particular concept proposed by a speaker or thinker or writer based only or merely on the skin tone of that speaker or thinker or writer, okay? So it's racist. Number 3, the concept of white theology isn't just a categorical analog of Nazism, which it is. It's also a logical fallacy called the genetic fallacy. So a speaker is guilty of the genetic fallacy when he sees an idea or author as untrustworthy, specifically because of the race or origin of the idea. So to say that an idea is suspect because the speaker is white, or to say that the speaker's whiteness has conceptually infected the idea somehow through osmosis, that's a logical fallacy. And the inability to perceive this fallacy in the very category of white theology is an inability to accept the constraints of the rules of rationality, which are the laws of logic. So a commitment to this concept of white theology is really a commitment to irrationalism and to racism and to conceptual ambiguity. Now, here's my second reason why I mainly read white male theologians, or my problem with racialized theology. It's that racialized theology is hypocritical. So I often hear people argue, so sort of SJW leftist-oriented Christians, that Christianity isn't the white man's religion. So they're sort of trying to reclaim Christianity from whiteness, right? So let's just go with that for a second, right? So I often hear people argue that Christianity isn't the white man's religion because Jesus was actually Middle Eastern. And hey, didn't you know that Augustine is black and all that kind of stuff, right? So let's just talk about Jesus for a second, right? What if Jesus was white? Would that make Christianity the white man's religion? No, it wouldn't. Okay, one of the expressed purposes of Jesus' work was to relieve tension between ethnicities, Galatians 3:28. There's neither Jew nor Greek, right? It doesn't matter if Jesus looked like Napoleon Dynamite or The Rock or Chris Rock. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The implicit assumption in arguing that the race of a theologian is materially relevant to the legitimacy of the idea they propose will destroy Christianity, okay? If there is any need to argue that Jesus wasn't white in order to accept the teachings of Jesus, then those conclusions are accepted on the basis of racist premises, namely that if Jesus were white, this would somehow corrode the credibility of his claims. This is false. Okay, race should never be a premise in an argument for or against Christianity, and Christians should reject such premises. They should never share them with their racially motivated interlocutors. In other words, racialized theology is hypocritical because once you buy the premise that race plays a role in determining the legitimacy of certain ideas, this theory cuts both ways. So if you need Jesus to be white to be a Christian, then your faith is dependent on a certain historical contingency that's not taught in the Bible. So if one day we discover that Jesus was white, well, then your faith is toast. Or if one day we discover that Augustine wasn't actually black, well, but was actually, the space bug from Men in Black, well, then now you can't be an Augustinian anymore, right? And racialized theology makes theology about race as opposed to about ideas, and theology should be about ideas, not the race of a theologian. Number 3, most of the best theologians throughout history were white men, which is why I mainly read white men as theologians. Thomas Aquinas, Peter Abelard, Bonaventure, Martin Luther, Melanchthon, John Calvin. If you neglect the writings of these men and you seek to understand the best ideas in theology, you are a fool. You're going to be bad at theology. You're not going to achieve your goal. And I will grant that there is such a thing as black theology insofar as it represents a political movement that utilizes theological ideas to advance a particular economic and social agenda. But this isn't a theology per se. You would probably better call it a theological appropriation or a political appropriation of theological ideas. The ideas themselves aren't black. Likewise, Thomas's argument for God from motion isn't white theology, and neither is his doctrine of creation or his doctrine of the Trinity, right? Or any of these things. And if I accept or reject them, it shouldn't be on the basis of his race, of course. Number 4, most evangelical female writers aren't good theologians, even the ones that try to be. So, or I should rather maybe even reword this point. They aren't credible academic theologians. So, for example, I remember reading one woman comment during the Trinity and subordination debate involving Kevin Giles and Bruce Ware, mainly occurred during the 2015-2016 sort of theology news cycle. And this woman commented in this question of is the second person of the Trinity functionally subordinate to the Father, in that he, according to the economy of the Trinity, de facto defers to the will of the Father, and the operations include an aspect of subordination, not ontological subordination, but functional subordination. It really doesn't matter, right? But it has to do with gender and whether or not that subordination, proposed subordination between the Father and the Son, A, if it was heretical, and B, whether that served as a precedent for a subordination between a husband and a wife, or whether it served as the ultimate analog for the husband-wife subordination complementarian relationship, that is, whether the Trinity entailed complementarianism. That was the question. It doesn't matter. The point is that this woman commented, why aren't we asking the female perspective on this women's issue about the Trinity? Here's the thing. It's not a women's issue, okay? It's an issue of Trinitarian theology. And I would know, I published several articles in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society on this very issue, and was invited to speak, and did speak, at the Evangelical Theological Society conference session devoted to this issue that year, the year that it caused all this turmoil. And Kevin Giles, one of the main interlocutors in this debate, and on the stage at ETS, on the main stage at ETS, he cited explicitly my articles specifically as an archetypal taxonomy for conceiving the debate. So I remember one woman on Twitter asking, why isn't anyone in this eternal subordination of the Son debate referencing Jen Wilkins' book, None Like Him? I actually love Jen Wilkins' writing. Okay, she's doing really good stuff, I think, and I've read her books, and I think I commend her books to readers, not just female readers, but male readers. But the only way you could think that Jen Wilkins' book could be a primary text in the Trinity debate, or even that it ought to be a tertiary text in the debate, is if you have no idea what you're talking about, okay? It's a ridiculous suggestion, okay? Nobody would take seriously the suggestion that you ought to read that book, or if you reference that book in debate, it would be very poor form. Why? Is it because theologians are sexist? No. It's because she doesn't do original theological work in the book. Okay, she doesn't enter into any conversations with any materially relevant, concepts in an informing or academically profound way. And it's like a homeowner looking over a plumber's shoulder asking, like, why don't you use that other wrench? She should use that other wrench. And the plumber's just like, lady, are you a plumber? Do you know what you're talking about? You don't. Let me do my job, right? Plumbing is indirectly a women's issue, right? But I'm not going to prioritize a female plumber just because of her gender. And the question is whether a writer is skilled in the methodology appropriate for providing an excellent answer, not what firsthand experience a writer has with the topic itself. So this is called competency confusion, okay? Your experience doesn't serve as a credential to speak authoritatively on a topic, okay? You either know what you're talking about or you don't. Your genitals and your skin color have nothing to do with that competency. Number 5. Tokenism produces incompetence, not competence. So in the movie There Will Be Blood, great movie, Daniel Day-Lewis explains the actor Daniel Day-Lewis in playing his character explains to the town, he says, I'm an oil man, ladies and gentlemen. As an oil man, I hope that you'll forgive just good old-fashioned plain speaking, right? And he cuts through the BS, right, to speak plainly. And by analogy, let me just say what I am, okay? I'm an ideas man. I don't care what color your skin is, what gender you are. I don't care. I do not give an F. I have no Fs to give. And if you can talk the ideas well, then I want to talk. If you're going to push some equal outcome through tokenism for the sake of balanced representation of skin color and gender, I'm not interested in talking, because I'm not interested in having that conversation, and I'm not interested in having a fabricated accusation thrown at me of racism and sexism, which has become such commonplace, such stock and trade among leftist intersectional leaning evangelicals. Okay, I just don't care, not even a little bit, not even a little bit. And a good theologian shouldn't care about these issues. Okay, a good human being shouldn't care. And as Thomas Sowell writes, affirmative action hurts Black people because people assume that Black employees were hired due to their Blackness, further deepening the rationale for justified prejudice against Blacks within the institution once they've gotten in, right? Affirmative action is willing to trade the slowly acquired bona fide respect based on competence for the quickly gained status that competency yields. Now, the best means of achieving equality of opportunity for all races and genders, which is the best way of achieving equality for all races and genders, is to hold the same standard of competence for everyone. So, does it really feel good to Black authors or minority authors or female authors, to those authors, when they win a spot in blogs that have titles like Top 5 Minority Books on Theology, Top 5 Books That White Males Aren't Reading? Right? It's insulting. Okay, it's racist and it's sexist, and it's actually it's demeaning to those authors themselves. Okay, to create like a special Olympics for minority authors, which is what it is, as if to say like, well, these blogs are intended to say the opposite of this, but actually make this racist assumption, which is actually sort of a white supremacist assumption, which we should all reject, which is the assumption of these blogs is to say, well, we all know that white men produce the best theology, but if you take them out of the equation, which we need to do, here are the best 5 books. Here are the best 10 books, right? It's ridiculous. Don't fabricate an equality of outcome. Don't make your standard a balanced representation of ethnicities and genders in your top 5 or must reads, top 5 black authors. What? Read the best thing, okay? Read the best stuff on the stuff that you're talking about, okay? Best 5 books on a certain topic. That's an interesting blog. Best 5 books in this genre. That's an interesting blog. Read the most influential. Read the most sophisticated. Read the most historically foundational ideas. This notion of like, oh, what white men aren't reading, what white men don't want you to read, top 5 people who aren't whites. It is insulting to those authors who are included. Even if they feel it's insulting or not, it's an insult. Number 6, the neglect of white male theologians will produce bad theology, okay? So I only have so much time to read, and so do you. And so when you require yourself to read more books from other genders and other races just for the sake of reading other books by other genders and other races, you by necessity read less of other books. Now, you either see that as a reduction of intake from the white perspective, or you see it as reading foundational, primary, indispensable ideas less. Okay, I've seen people blog about how necessary it is that to read certain books by ethnic and gender minorities published by Moody Press or Crossway. And these authors who are making these suggestions, I know for a fact, haven't read Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics or Turretin's Institutes or Van Til's Defense of the Faith or Muller's Post-Reformation Reformed Dogmatics or Thomas's Summa Contra Gentiles or Augustine's Retractions, okay? And that's fine. But if you're going to tell me that rectifying ethnic and gender disparity among the authors of books I read is more important than acquiring, or rather acquainting myself with the primary texts themselves, then you are wrong. And the only reason you could say that is if you hadn't really read the primary text yourself, which tells me that you're a bad theologian, which tells me that you're not a credible source on these issues, which tell me that you shouldn't be writing about this in the first place. The only people who insist upon ethnic and gender balance among theological authors you read are those who really aren't very acquainted with the deeper ideals of theology or the primary texts which constitute and inform us about those ideas. 7. Most white male theologians don't perpetuate racism or sexism. So come to think of it, I don't think any widely accepted evangelical theologians propose a theological distinction between ethnicities or sexes. Okay, the only exception is whether you intend to classify complementarianism as a de facto sexist position. So, okay, let's say that that's a debate worth having, right? But we should assume that complementarian theologians, at their best, they're not actually motivated by sexism, okay? You could maybe say an idea perpetuates sexism, but let's look at those theologians, okay? Complementarian theologians, at their best, are merely seeking to teach what the Bible teaches and aren't malicious women haters who are trying to twist the text of Scripture in order to subordinate women or subjugate them to the male gaze or whatever, leftist feminist nonsense people are saying these days, right? In that regard, if you believe complementarianism is sexist as a concept, which is, again, that's an idea. I'm willing to have conversations about ideas, right? And if you believe complementarianism is a sexist idea, at least recognize that if the Bible does teach complementarianism, then the Bible would be sexist, okay? So use that term at your own discretion. If you accept the methodological preconditions of Christian orthodoxy, then you have obligated yourself to judge as morally upright the teachings of Scripture, whatever they are, and not the opposite, which is to bring your version of moral uprightness to Scripture and then require Scripture to conform to that vision. And the point is this, to propose that people need to read proportionately less white male theologians is to suggest that whiteness and maleness sufficiently infect the theological ideas they teach, that this infection requires an antidote of balance by ideas that are equally and perhaps oppositely infected. And this is an unjustifiable and, quite honestly, philosophically indefensible premise. So, in conclusion, if you want to become very good at theology, you should be reading mostly white male theologians. Is Frederick Douglass a worthwhile theologian? Well, Douglass had a bust of Ludwig Feuerbach in his office. Do you like Hegelian dialecticism? Do you like Ludwig Feuerbachianism? Do you like the theological ideas he proposed besides his political message about slavery? Well, do you? Think about the ideas. That's all I'm saying. And when you think about the ideas, you end up reading a corpus that is written or composed in majority by white males. Is that a problem? No. It's not a problem. Why would that be a problem? Okay? When you're talking about theology, you're talking about ideas. You're not talking about the skin color of the theologian, unless you're a racist. Read the best theology. The authors of that corpus happen primarily to be white men. Deal with it.